I thought it was important just this morning to give you a bit of a broad overview of the BIC work program and what we're sort of looking at in 2018-19, which builds a little bit on, or a lot, on what we've been talking about here for the last few days. So I'm happy for you to stop me and ask me any questions if you want to know what I'm on about, or what we're planning to do, or why aren't we doing something else. Just an opportunity for you to maybe contribute to the work program. The work program's pretty much signed off by the BIC Council each year, though it does I mean, generally it's a 5-year work program and rolls over if we haven't completed stuff. But I guess what we've always said is we're primarily a research, policy development and advocacy organisation, and everything revolves around those three things. But if you don't have the research and don't have the policy, then you most want to do the advocacy. You know, no use turning up and saying it's not fair to a politician, because they don't really care about much. You've got to have the evidence and then give them an idea of how it might work in a policy sense. So research for the next year or two is really going to be focused around these 4 things. We're shortly going to have a report out on regional mobility and connectivity, which is looking at connectivity in the context of connecting villages to towns, to regional centres, to cities. It's an important link, and it's just not about social exclusion or social inclusion, but there are important economic factors that drive how our regions work with our cities. And I guess the reality is, as our cities are getting bigger, one of the pressure valves that governments are going to use is to see how we can grow our regional centres and the surrounding towns. So how public transport, how transit works, how mobility as a service works in a regional sense is important. And this report puts some form of focus on those particular issues. So you'll probably see that coming out in probably February or March next year. You heard from Stephen Lucas about the exercise they've been running in Warrnambool called Connect You. It's an important exercise which is really at the core of this report in some senses. Connect You is sort of an early form of a regional Uber. It's just a social shop front where we've got someone for manning a phone that's connecting a transport need to a transport asset. And one of the interesting things out of that exercise in Warrnambool is the number of people who have actually learned how to catch the public transport bus as an option rather than relying on the community transport bus or other services. So he's actually had an interesting increase in patronage, which I was hoping he'd cover off just by engaging in that discussion with other people with other assets that are underutilised in their area. So it's important stuff. And importantly, in South Australia, the Hoof, who did a wonderful job on stage last night, the Hoof has received some funding from the South Australian government to run a pilot in Port Pirie, very much based around the concept of regional accessibility committees. And we think that more and more we're going to see the federal, state and local governments looking at that as an option. And so we believe there's going to be some scope for funding for other operators, either through the federal government, the state governments, to actually move into that space. You heard Wayne on Monday talk about the public transport network benchmarking. I mean, it's an important exercise just to make sure that when we're looking at value for money when it comes to the delivery of public transport services, it's not just related to price, and that the transport agencies are equally accountable for their performance. They're the one with all the dough. And if it's not delivering the societal outcomes that government's seeking in a policy sense, then they need to be kept to account. It's not just up to the bus operator caught in the congestion to be blamed because he's late. It's actually about how the agencies deal with those issues. So an important part of what we're doing. It's not about criticising the agencies, it's about improving the agencies and our opportunities. Bus and mobility as a service is going to be a feature report which is going to look at a whole range of things in relation to technology, how it might work. Some of the stuff that you saw from Yale Wong yesterday when he looked at, you know, future contracts and what they might be, and that anyone in that session who saw the work that they're doing in that space, it's very, very important stuff. And I think in some senses David Hensher and his crew is leading the way in that whole future contractual arrangements. And something I'm planning to do, which we just started some discussions with executive directors on Sunday, is doing a national industry survey. We haven't done it, but it's sort of a census on the industry just to see how many operators there are, how many drivers, how many people are employing, how many vehicles, but also on the manufacturing side, looking at the number of people they've employed directly and indirectly, with a view to getting more accurate idea of the contribution that our industry is making to the economy. So all of those are the four core things. There's some other stuff going on, but that's probably the four core aspects of our work program. Hopefully a lot of you have seen these policy documents, and I won't go through all of that, but we've done 9 policy documents in the last just over 2 years. And each of them are individually important because they sort of they're building blocks of telling a story about how moving people in our cities and regions are important. But it also forms an important part of our advocacy effort, because the plan with these things was we want to put in these publications, which are about 25 to 30 pages each. Want them to land on every politician's desk every quarter or every 6 months. So we developed them all very much in the same sort of marketing way. Built a little cardboard compendium, so the first 5 went into a compendium. So their first edition, they got a compendium with a letter saying, in the next few months you'll be receiving these. So the idea was not just to sell the message, but to keep our name and our policy stuff right in their face. There's no better way when you receive something in the mail on a regular basis to start to think that you're part of a club. And that was part of the exercise and part of our advocacy efforts. So there's more to it than the research, and there's more to it than the policy development. It's how we sell that message, and part of that was that marketing. And so hopefully a lot of you have received these. If you haven't, they're all available online. But it's an important aspect, and over the next little bit, papers 10 to 14 will come out of the back end of that research that I just talked about. And we'll also be doing some special editions. So you'll see there we did 2 special editions as part of those 9 policy documents. It was separate documents, which were, one was on Hobart, a corridor case study, which looked at the light rail program down here that we did with Tasbus and looked at what all the other options are. Interestingly, identified that neither light rail or bus rapid transit were actually appropriate for what they were looking for, because Hobart wasn't ready. But it effectively said the corridor should be retained, but Hobart's densities and population don't justify the expenditure at this stage, which surprised everybody that the industry was actually taking a much more pragmatic view than the light rail advocates were, who just think that light rail should go everywhere all the time, no matter what it costs and who doesn't travel on it. And the special edition we'll be doing shortly is just a replication of our recent submission to the federal government's inquiry into the federal government's role in our cities. And John Stanley mentioned that we recently appeared in front of that committee and provided evidence, but we'll publish that report because in essence, it sort of pulls together the first 9 policy papers into a summarised 25 pages. So the big issues for bus, from I guess the state and federal and the elections and where we're at, I mean, these are my thoughts on where we're sort of at the moment, what I think are the core themes that we need to continue, but cities and public transport, land use, planning and integrated transport. I mean, that's the core of our advocacy efforts and our policy research. You know, we talk about moving people and how you do that most efficiently, but it's never going to work efficiently unless you've got the land use right, the planning right, and the integrated transport all connected. And if you get that right, then logically bus services are actually going to have to grow, because they're either going to be feeding rail or they're going to be operating on trunk routes or whatever it might be. And the Sydney Commission and New South Wales, I think, have really picked up on that core theme with their announcement about 3 weeks ago of a 40-year strategy for Sydney, where they're basically planning to have 3 cities in one as they move to 8 million population. And on each side of that city strategy is a land use plan and a transport plan. Now, the idea is that those plans are 40-year plans. They're updated every 5 to 10 years, but they actually set a constant in relation to infrastructure investment, for example. So it goes beyond the election cycle. And what we've been arguing in Canberra is the federal government's role is to tie their funding for infrastructure to these plans. So state governments can't change the plans when they get a new premier because he's got a pet project. The funding is actually based around sticking to the plans that you developed and actually having a long-term view. And you heard from Michael Rochelow about where Canada's gone in that space in Toronto and Vancouver, which is very much focused on plans out to 2040 that are the core attachment to funding from the feds. Obviously, bus and mobility as a service is going to be an ongoing issue, and how we manage that at a state and federal level. I think in some senses we're ahead of the game. It's interesting if you look in San Francisco at the moment, there's a lot of argy-bargy going on between the local transit authority there and the company called Chariot, who's competing directly with them exactly along their designated routes and taking their passengers. And the state authority, although the transit authority, which is effectively local government, because all American transit's run by local government, there's no private operators in the US, or one or two companies who, such as Transdev, for example, who run some management franchises, but largely the transit's run by local municipalities. When I say we're ahead of the game, it's interesting that the New South Wales state government has actually engaged the industry to do the on-demand trials, rather than what we're seeing in the States, where these companies have come in like Uber and are already running micro-transit and competing against public transport. New South Wales, and what I'd expect other state governments, are actually trying to engage industry. So I think we're lucky in the sense that we're ahead of the game, and we need to take that opportunity. How those on-demand trials go, some will work no doubt and some might fail, but you might learn something about where they do work and they don't work. And that's going to be the interesting component to that. As I mentioned, regional connectivity and accessibility is a key theme. I talked about connecting our cities, and that really is sitting behind a whole of government. Each political party currently has got a view about decentralisation, taking pressure off our cities and growing some of our regions, which therefore gets them thinking, well, if we're going to do that, then we've got to make sure our cities are connected to our regions. So decentralisation, the exports from our regional areas. Education is a key driver to assist in decentralisation, regional universities, and ultimately transport. And because manufacturers obviously and suppliers are a member of ours, and you purchase all their materials, all the stuff in relation to new technologies and fuels, electrification, hydrogen, whether hybrids are in between or where we might want to go, is an interesting concept. I thought that the announcement last night by Scania was interesting, because it's effectively a 10-year plan to get rid of a bus, isn't it? Well, if you're thinking about electrification and governments are worrying about, if I buy a new diesel bus now and it's going to last 25 years, I'm slowing down the process of electrification of the fleets. That 10-year model might be interesting, and I know it already happens in other manufacturers, but it might be an interesting model for the governments to consider, that they're not stuck into a very long-term vehicle program that actually doesn't allow them to move to electrification faster. The challenge for electrification will be the infrastructure and recharging, which is probably holding Australia up at the moment. But you know, if you go to the US, they haven't necessarily, they say they've got it right, but I'm not quite convinced that they've got it exactly right, but that's good. We'll get there. Infrastructure Australia and investment in public transport is going to be an important focus. We participate on the federal government city reference group chaired by Angus Taylor, the Minister. We think the metropolitan planning authorities, which is a mix of federal, state and local governments, the governance arrangement that we think can drive the right outcomes for getting transport right. And that's a big theme for our focus in the city's reference group. And effectively, the Sydney Commission, which has been established in Tim Reardon's department, the Department of Transport for New South Wales, is effectively a metropolitan planning authority that's acting as a conduit to pull together planning, land use and transport. And we think that's the right kind of model, and that'll be a continued focus. Benchmarking and decision making again. The National Heavy Vehicle Regulator and where bus fits is going to keep us busy, because issues just keep emerging as we progress. No matter how we look at national consistency and harmonisation, some states are sometimes just a little bit different, and it ends up creating some interesting issues in relation to compliance, such as one going on at the moment, for example, and something as simple as different arrangements in regard to rear overhang on buses over 12.5 metres, where, you know, in New South Wales currently some operators are getting pinged because they don't have a permit, but the NHVR notice says they don't require a permit, but New South Wales required a permit, but neither of them issue permits. Simple stuff, but it's actually important for industry to keep on top of that stuff. And as I said, new services, new vehicles, new contracts, all of that's going to be an interesting part that we work closely with our state associations on. So selling the message, I talked about the policy papers, and they'll continue. The Cities Reference Forum, we run a parliamentary friendship group for better cities, which is an important part of our broad-based approach to advocacy. We act as secretariat to this group. It's in federal parliament. There's a whole range of parliamentary friendship groups that do a range of things, from you know, the Armenian Love-In Club to the Rugby League Lovers Club, but we run a Better Cities Club. It's got 14, it's true. But there's 14 national organisations that form part of that, and we run four events a year with a special guest speaker, invite members and senators along to listen to pretty much what we wanted to tell them, which relates to transport, cities, the things that we think need to happen. Obviously, parliamentary inquiries and submissions are never ending, but you need to be engaged in that because you get the opportunity to appear and provide evidence and sell your message. This is one of the key bits about selling our message. It's actually convincing the industry we know what we're doing, and that's both from a BIC and a state association perspective, and hopefully convincing you that we're actually got a good message to sell and you go and sell it just as much as we do as associations. And BIC on the Road, which is an exercise where the chairman and I each year travel to every state and territory in the federal government, meet ministers, shadow ministers, director generals and secretaries, capital city Lord Mayors, and we have a pretty set program annually to actually go and let people know we're around. And because they've got to know us over the years, we've got a pretty good open door access to most ministers, or all ministers I'd suggest. So important part. Probably something we can do a bit better at BIC is how our committees are structured. A lot of the time it's sort of driven by the Secretariat. I'm a believer in not just having meetings for the sake of having meetings, so some people wish that all of these groups met regularly, and if it did that then we wouldn't do anything else except meet regularly. So, but they're the core, they drive the, I guess, the policy foundation of. At the top of that, obviously, we've got the BIC Council, but we have an executive management group that oversees the day-to-day operations and staffing and other issues in relation to BIC, so that I don't get out of control as the crazy dictator. National contracts and benchmarking, long-distance charter and express, and where we're working in that tourism sector and the coach sector. And taxes, charges and infrastructure, all core stuff that, you know, when issues emerge, those committees can kick into action. So a few years ago, for example, the taxes, charges and infrastructure group worked very hard on the changes to depreciation of your vehicles. Well, it was suggested that depreciation should be extended to the actual life, which was 25 years. And we actually managed to pull that back to 7.5 by getting government to understand how the industry worked and was structured and the importance of the depreciation being a little bit more accelerated. It went from 5 to 7.5, but didn't go to 25. Macca's group there, the Industrial Working Group, obviously become a big part of the BIC, and Macca does a great job in working with the states through his Industrial Working Group, and it's a huge group, 25 or 30 people on at Macca that I think sort of calls his nerds, who all follow him around like little ducklings. As Macca tells them, it's over here, and then I tell Macca it's over there, let's get out of the burrow and go and find out the real issue. No, it's not. Macca's got it all under control. It's good, and the technical stuff's very important, and Luke Hardy, as most of you knows, acts as our technical manager and coordinates the issues with the suppliers and the operators to manage that. Communication's probably another area that we're, you know, it's a big focus. A lot of it's probably more revolved around our research than a media presence. We're running a social media trial, or not a trial anymore, but through Bus SA, where Lauren effectively operates our social media and puts us onto Tweet and Facebook and all of that stuff that I hate. So, but everybody says we need to be in it, so we're in it. But we're not really media. What was that?
Albo started following you yesterday.
Oh, did he? Albo? He's been following us for a long time. Mate. Thanks, mate. And the website and YouTube are all valuable tools to people. So if you go onto our website, all of the suppliers I actually find don't take advantage of that website because it gets a lot of hits. A lot of operators, surprisingly, are checking it out. There's YouTube ads there where some of the manufacturers take the opportunity to put their product on and others don't. But we're not really media junkies. We don't go out trying to get our name in the newspaper or on television or radio. We don't necessarily see that as our main game. You can do that and put a press release out every day, like some organisations do. And they're very happy, and their members are very happy because they read it on the media summaries, but they never get a run. So we're pretty strategic about where we go with that. So what are the questions in 2018, 19? I think the compliance stuff coming up in relation to accessible transport standards and your vehicle fleet's an interesting challenge, where we're getting to sort of 100% compliant times in 2021, I think, 2022, which is And I don't know what 100% compliant actually means. It's a difficult area, but I think the industry is going to actually need to have a little bit of a think about how we manage that from a state government perspective and make sure that operators, we get some flexibility probably about how we do that. And there's a whole range of discussions going on about equivalent access and how we actually best use equivalent access as a mechanism to provide alternative mobility choices for people with a disability, rather than your fleet having to be 100% compliant. If you can come up with an option, and sometimes the best option for some people with disabilities, if you can't provide the bus, is to put them in a taxi. Currently, however, that's not acceptable to the people because they want everything now as they like it, rather than what we argue from an industry perspective is it's not about the vehicle, it's about the mobility outcome for the person. And if you can deliver the mobility outcome and it's not on my bus, then what's the problem and why are you complaining? So there's some interesting argy-bargy. I talked about the sweet spot between subsidy and commercial services and where government's going to find itself in relation to that. And I think that's going to be an interesting and ongoing challenge. And Stephen Lucas talked a little bit about yesterday that the idea that some form of application might be developed that actually allows you to better understand individual circumstances, and that relates ultimately to the fare that they pay. Not sure where that's heading, but it's the last thing we need is for governments to try and think that mobility as a service is actually only a good excuse to walk away and not fund anything, and then remove the safety nets that are available in the context of social inclusion, but at the same time forget the societal outcomes they've been seeking from the public transport network, which we're all aware of is congestion management, reduced environmental footprint, social inclusion, better roads, improved road safety outcomes, improved health outcomes. The list goes on about the benefits of public transport. We've got to make sure governments don't forget about the benefits of public transport and just look at the bottom line and the costs. Because that subsidy is a subsidy of fares to actually promote the use of public transport to reduce the number of cars on the road. It's an important message we need to keep going. I think local government's becoming more and more an important role as the federal government gets more involved in cities. Local government and a bottom-up approach is going to be important for industry to be engaging at your local government level, and we need to have a little think about how we best do that. As I said before, the role of regions and connectivity is interesting. The current government's view about regional connectivity is that high-speed rails is not the answer and it's too expensive, but faster rail and better coach services is the way to go to actually better connect our villages, towns, regions and cities. And I think they've probably got a point. High-speed rail might have its day, but that's going to actually be a whole different exercise to connecting regional Australia completely. High-speed rail will suit one corridor along the east coast. It might come. But what do you think are the hot issues? That's probably the question. That's the quick overview of where we're at, I think, from an industry perspective. I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks. Except from Lauren. You're not allowed to ask any questions, Hoof.
I actually do have a question, Michael. You talked about sweet spot on subsidy and who pays. Stephen Lucas raised it yesterday, where's the money? What work are we doing about deriving the cost-benefit ratio of public transport so that when cabinets sit down to make decisions, we have a number that we can tell them they'll derive in each region from what they invest?
Well, John Stanley's already done a little bit of work in the space, which we've used, which is actually trying to measure the value of a bum on a seat, I guess you might say. Ultimately, the big picture stuff when it comes to budgets is probably where we need to have a little bit more of a focus going forward, which I think forms part of our mobility as a service work, that we actually got to get that cost-benefit analysis and, what's the value of public transport, what's the value of a bum on a seat, what are the intangible benefits that are very hard to measure, and which Treasury hate because they don't want to account the fact that you're reducing emissions as a dollar value, or that you're actually having an impact on social inclusion, which has a dollar impact because it actually saves people dollars in relation to their health outcomes. What's the value of 41 minutes incidental exercise when you catch public transport versus 8 minutes incidental exercise when you drive your car to work? Well, there's a value because you're getting it half an hour a day just by walking to and from the bus stop and to and from where you work. So those health benefits are measurable, and governments are very good at measuring the cost of smoking and the health impacts and justifying why smoking should be banned or restricted or whatever, but when it comes to other things like public transport, not so willing to jump in and measure those intangible benefits that are actually are valuable. So we need to do some work, but I think it fits in that mass stuff because we need to actually explain that those values exist. The commercial services over here can operate, and if they work, they work, but let's understand that mass transit and social transit are important components from a government policy perspective. So I think it's in the mass research, Lauren. And some of the work you're doing in Port Pirie. I should have mentioned that we have a huge technical agenda going on that the committee works. So currently there's a review of the Australian Design Rule 58, which is all of the Australian design rules that relate to buses for hire and reward. It's a massive exercise, but its actually aim is to make it less ambiguous and easier to work with. Obviously got a whole range of issues going on with bus door safety currently, and a tech spec being developed in New South Wales that we're working with Threco on. There's some issues in relation to school bus flashing lights in New South Wales that we'll see a new standard develop there, and at the same time we're developing a national school bus warning light standard that we'll be putting out for consultation as part of some funding from the NHVR. So that technical area is a very full agenda that I didn't mention as well. So we're all happy?
Michael, Roger Mees Bus Lines in Melbourne. I'd just like to know what BIC are doing to represent industry with the rollout of the NDIS and how that's going to affect operators moving forward, and also in terms of mass as well. I noticed you mentioned the taxis as an option, but what are BIC doing for industry in that regard?
That's a good question. Chris Lowe's leading the, BAV, or I guess the lead agency, as I'd call, for the industry on the issue. The NDIS and the impact on special school services has its biggest effect in Victoria, because that's where a majority of that work is actually done by bus operators under contractual arrangements. Queensland and Tasmania have some operators in that space, but and a lot of other states aren't affected. So we decided that Chris Lowe would take on the role as the lead agency. We've appeared in a number of inquiries in the federal government about why we think the school bus market is a mature, regulated market, and it should be retained. That trying to put choice or create a market in that space is crazy. That it's actually proven, it's been proven in the test of time. But so we're working at a federal government level. I know that each of the associations where there's an impact of trying to convince state governments that it's not a good idea. There's quite a deal of, ideology that exists within the NDIS administration about what their task is and where they want to go. And so there's a lot of argy-bargy going on currently about where we think it should end up. I think we've had a good hearing from a federal government perspective. The cost blowout of the NDIS is probably working to our advantage. And so we might get there, but there's a few challenges, and I know, speaking to Chris at the executive directors meeting and the council meeting on the weekend, they're looking at a fairly big federal election strategy in the affected states and marginal seats coming up in the federal election to try and convince them that the issue is not worth losing your seat for. So there's quite a bit going on in that space, but no good news except that it's sort of been on delay for some time. The whole issue's been pushed back. They still haven't. The federal government offered the $600,000 to go on for a university to go and do a review of whether they could create a market, which just means, can we find other operators who will do the same job for cheaper? That's been on hold for some time. There's clearly a view that, I guess from an industry perspective, the mix is already right. People already have a choice, and the people travelling on the special school bus transport do it because their parents like it, because it has some societal benefits for their children to interrelate with others. You've got the expertise, and both in the driver and the assistants on those vehicles, a whole range of investment that's actually worked over time. So I think we'll get there, but it's a tough task because of the ideological drivers that are within NDIA to get over, but I think Chris is doing a great job in that space, and if there's a small group working away at it. Okay.